With the World Confectionery Conference around the corner, we speak to Jon Walker of Fairtrade about how the organisation is reaching out to cocoa growing communities in key producing nations of Ghana and Ivory Coast to help ensure the future sustainability of the sector, as it comes to terms with especially challenging conditions in 2021. Just to kick things off, if you could please tell us about how concerned you are regarding the situation in West Africa, in particular for the sourcing of cocoa beans, which is a core market.
Yeah, so we're really concerned at the moment, Neil. The price of cocoa is an absolute disaster. It's far too low. And if we expect to see sustainable cocoa, that is just a complete fantasy without farmers being able to achieve a living income. Last time we published some research a few years ago, we found 50%, 52% of farmers in Côte d'Ivoire were living in extreme poverty. And we have to change that situation. And one of the ways we're going to be able to change that situation is by addressing price.
In Ghana and Ivory Coast in particular, where Fairtrade and many others are involved with their cocoa sourcing, the prices, as you say, have been very suppressed lately, and also the living income differential that was brought in to help farmers is unfortunately being effectively wiped out because of the reduction in prices. So how concerning is that to you?
Well, it's extremely concerning because it's extremely concerning to farmers. As I was saying earlier, 52% of farmers living in extreme poverty. The majority of those cocoa farmers' income comes from cocoa. So price is a critical element if you're going to reach a living income for farmers. And I think what we need to shift away from as a sector is this concept of supply and demand defining prices. The reality is that cocoa farmers, brands, retailers, they're in long-term relationships. So let's shift this. So long-term relationships now include long-term contracts, secure pricing, security for farmers so they can plan for the future.
If you could please talk us through about how Fairtrade is engaged in trying to support these farmers in a broader sense.
Yeah, so immediately on the price issue, the Fairtrade minimum price is now active. So the farm gate price in Côte d'Ivoire is roughly around $1,340 per tonne. The Fairtrade, when cocoa sold at the Fairtrade minimum price, there's an additional about $318 that goes directly back to the farmers. Now, unfortunately, we're in the light season and very little Fairtrade cocoa is sold during the light season. But still, if the Fairtrade cocoa is sold, then this additional financial benefit will go back to the farmers. Wider than that, of course, we have our long-term cooperative strengthening program, the West Africa Cocoa program, programs on gender through the Women's School of Leadership, agroforestry, etc.
No, indeed, and just coming on to the topic related to that sort of support for communities out there, in relation to child labour, which remains a very pressing issue there. There's been reports from the University of Chicago in relation to levels of child labour, and it's been found that 1.5 million children are still in child labour in that region. So what steps do you believe need to be taken to try and redress that?
Well, there's some great work that's been going on in terms of addressing child labour through the child labour monitoring and remediation systems that have been put in place by the International Cocoa Initiative and others. Fairtrade has its own version, youth inclusive community-based monitoring and remediation. But really, we just need to drag this back. If farmers are living in extreme poverty, we need to solve that issue. If we can get to a living income, then that is going to resolve many of the issues that are in place. We need to consider what a living income is. A living income gives people access to food, access to decent housing, access to education, children out of school, access to education, important for child labour. So we need to keep this focus on how do we get farmers to a living income.
And just on that note, in terms of trying to make people's lives better in the farming community over there, it's been pointed out that one of the means of doing that is, as you say, simply raising the price of cocoa and ultimately people paying more for chocolate. So is that something you would welcome happening, that the prices of actual finished product going up significantly to try and enable those better living conditions?
Well, the price for farmers has to go up. Now, how that price is dealt with throughout the supply chain is a question for the supply chain partners, retailers, brands, etc. We're working with companies like Tony's, Ben & Jerry's, Reaver Supermarket, who are engaged in living income projects where they have agreed to pay a higher price to farmers as part of a holistic approach to living income, looking at farm efficiency, cooperative strengthening, supporting the farmers with farm record keeping, and many other things, which aims to get those farmers to a living income. So you can see that brands can engage, retailers can engage, and they can do this. Those brands and retailers and many others are showing this. What we need to do now is to get the vast majority or all of the sector into that space.
That's great. And just coming on to our event now, the World Confectionery Conference, and sustainability as a broad subject is very much at the core of our event. And how are you feeling about being a part of it for next week?
Really excited to be part of the event. It's great to have these events, whether they're online or in person. The power of them is they convene people together. And when we convene people together in these spaces, we can start to have the dialogues, which means that sustainable cocoa becomes closer to being a reality.
Fantastic stuff. And just on a personal note, can you explain your own journey with Fairtrade and what keeps you ticking with regards to your role?
This job's the most interesting job in the world. I absolutely love it. I love working for Fairtrade. And the reason that I love it is because I see the whole supply chain from farmer to shopper. And if I'm ever having a down moment, if I'm ever feeling that something's getting on top of me, I think back to my experiences going to Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, other countries, and working with the farmers. And that's really what drives me and motivates me.
How close do you believe we are to bringing about the kind of changes that we've talked about that need to happen to drive improvement in the market there?
I find it absolutely unconscionable that we will still be talking about this in 10 years' time. So the imperative is extreme that we make progress now. The difference between today and years gone by is that the problem has been quantified. We know what a living income is in Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, other countries, other important cocoa producing countries. We know the price that has to be achieved, combined with a holistic strategy to reach a living income. We have pilot companies working with us on these projects, as I was saying before, Tony's, Ben & Jerry's, etc., doing really critical work. We can do it, but we'll need the sector to come with us together.
Absolutely. And in the past year or so, obviously, we've been talking about conditions in the pandemic. It has had an impact, sadly, on many cocoa growing communities, not just in West Africa, just around the world. So have you done any analysis yourselves as to the actual level of impact there?
Yes, so we've really been very fortunate. We've had terrific support from the Swiss government, the German government and the British government. We have a fund of 15 million euros, a COVID relief and recovery fund, which is enabling us to work directly with the cooperatives whose members are Fairtrade certified. And that gives Fairtrade a super insight into what's happening. So what we saw at the beginning of the pandemic in West Africa, for example, was that farmers were worried about their harvest. Rural communities weren't willing to accept outsiders into the community for fear of spreading the pandemic. Obviously, schools were closed, so there was a worry about child labour. And the types of actions that we saw the cooperatives and their members take with these monies from the COVID relief and recovery fund was production of face masks, production of soap. There was also income diversification activities and provision of inputs. So really practical things that people could do. Now, currently, the situation seems to be that certainly in West Africa, the infections are in the cities and the rural communities haven't been as badly affected, thank goodness. And to some extent, things have returned to how they were previously. Training's taken place, harvesting's taken place, with people observing health protocols, which I guess would be the big difference.
But just coming back to the point of how you address the measures in relation to improving conditions on the ground for farmers, and I've written a lot about the remediation schemes to help communities, and one aspect of that is, or one of the outcomes that's been highlighted, is that scaling up operations to assist a wider pool of people is clearly the way forward. How does Fairtrade fit into that pattern? You have been involved with the Cocoa and Forest Initiative, is that correct?
So Fairtrade Africa trains cooperatives that we work with on what the Cocoa and Forest Initiative is, and on climate change, the impacts of climate change, the importance of the forest, etc. We work with over 400,000 farmers in West Africa now, so we are at scale. What we do need is we need to secure more sales on fair trade terms, because when we secure those sales on fair trade terms, the financial benefits we were talking about earlier, so the fair trade minimum price directly boosting household income, and the fair trade premium, which goes to the cooperatives, which then they decide as a collective of members how it's going to be spent and how they can address the problems which they see as a priority in the way that they see as the best way to address them happen. But we do need to increase sales on fair trade terms to do that.
Thank you for that. And so I was talking about the environmental impacts there. Is that something you directly are involved with yourself, how you manage Fairtrade's interaction with improving environmental performance?
Yeah, so Fairtrade works on environmental projects. We have a great project at the moment in Ghana called the Sankofa project, with the Swiss brand Chocolate Halber and Swiss Co-op and the International Trade Center. And that's working on agroforestry. We're seeing some super results there. So for example, the mortality rate of trees has dropped from 60% to 10%. When in the agroforestry project.
How optimistic are you that will be a sort of wider recovery from the pandemic in the sector, and that these key issues that we've been talking about will ultimately be resolved?
I think the sector absolutely has it in its grasp to get to sustainable cocoa, but there needs to be this laser focus on, let's get farmers to a living income. There are many things that will help a cocoa farmer to get to a living income as part of a holistic strategy, but price is absolutely critical. And at this time of low prices, we need to shift out of this behavior of supply and demand defining prices and move into long-term contracts with cooperatives and their farmer members. We are in a long-term relationship, whether you're a brand, a retailer, or a cocoa farmer. Now let's make this real by giving people security of long-term contracts and security of long-term prices.
Great stuff, Jon.